we were working under Communicore at the park. And we'd walk through the park every day. We'd go and check out as the shows were being brought up, and we'd do the testing. And we'd run through the tests till 3 a.m. And it was really this great thing. And then on opening day, you look out the gate and there's 30,000 people waiting to get in. And you realize it's not my park anymore.
That was author and former Imagineer David Green. And you're listening to the Tomorrow Society Podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 109 of the Tomorrow Society Podcast. As always, I am your host, Dan Heaton. I hope you had a good 4th of July weekend and you're hanging in there, trying to keep moving forward, stay positive as much as we can, because it is a challenging time and it is showing no signs of letting up. But I'm just trying to take it one day at a time, and I hope you are too. I'm really excited about today's show. My guest is David Green. He's the co-author of the book, Building a Better Mouse with Steve Alcorn. In the book, David and Steve talk about what it was like to be an engineer working on the construction of EPCOT Center during the months leading up to opening. I've wanted to talk to David for a while, and so it was really cool to finally get to hear his story about how he ultimately joined WED in 1980, what it was like to work on EPCOT Center at such a busy, crazy time for the company, and making this really cool park from the engineering side, which I think is really interesting to hear about the other end of it. And David also has worked at Disney in other roles on software and IT, and he talks about that another 11 years during the 1990s. So I haven't really talked to too many people that have that perspective of working beyond Imagineering in different roles at the company, especially during a time under Michael Eisner's leadership when the company was really expanding. We also talk about what David is currently doing at his company, Visual Terrain. He's had quite a career, much beyond the 3+ years that he worked at Disney from 1980 to 1983. So it's fun to talk about both what he did with Disney and then some other things too, and what interests him in general about theme parks and the theme entertainment industry. It was really cool, and I think you're going to enjoy it, especially if you're interested in the background of EPCOT Center, living at Fort Wilderness, and what that group kind of did at the time. Before I get to my conversation with David, I should also mention that I was recently a guest on the Book of the Mouse Club podcast with Courtney Guth and Emily McDermott. It was a blast to do. We focused on Treasure Island, starting with the original book by Robert Louis Stevenson, and then spent a lot of time on the Disney adaptation from 1950. Also talked about Muppet Treasure Island and Treasure Planet. Emily and Courtney typically focus on books. They talk with authors. They also review books. In this case, they are doing a summer cinema series, live action and literature. This is the first episode they've done, so it was really fun. I hadn't seen Treasure Island in a really long time, the Disney version, and enjoyed it quite a bit. It held up pretty well. And so if you'd like to listen to this episode, which I would highly recommend, I've put a link directly to the episode in the show notes for this podcast, or you can search for Book of the Mouse Club in Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast formats. Check it out. It was a blast to do. So I'm super excited for you to hear this show with David. He was a lot of fun to talk with and had a lot of great stories. So let's dive right into it. Here is David Green. I'd love to know kind of how you got started, like when you joined WED in 1980. How did that happen? How did you join working there?
Well, it's funny. I was working at a small company in North Hollywood that created air conditioning test equipment, of all things. And they got bought up by a bigger company in Chicago and moved the entire operation back to Chicago and laid us all off. And while I was looking for another job, my dad, who was an ardent Disney fan, noticed an ad, a classified ad in the LA Times, and he cut it out and gave it to me and said, "Why don't you apply for this job?" And it was a job at Walt Disney Imagineering, which at the time was called WED Enterprises. And I put together my resume. I was 19 years old, and I put together a resume that was 4 pages long and sent it in to them. And it was totally unprofessional. I had no idea that 4 pages is way too long for a 19-year-old, but I thought I wanted to show them everything I can do. And I sent it in to them and didn't hear back from them. And in the meantime, I got hired at another company and went to work there building communications equipment. And after I'd worked there for about 6 months, I got a call from WED, and they asked me to interview. And so I interviewed with them, and they offered me a job, and I actually turned it down because it wasn't enough money. I think they offered me $5.50 an hour, and I held out for $6 an hour. Because I was 19 years old and I didn't want to drive to Glendale without the extra 50 cents an hour to cover my gas for the week. And surprisingly, after they hung up the phone, like 3 days later, they called me back and they met my request. And so I started working there, and I really had no idea what I was going to do. I knew I was working in the engineering department. I knew it was on some new project, but I didn't really know what it was. And went and reported there on my first day. And my first day, they walked me around. They introduced me to a bunch of people, and they introduced me to a guy named Mark Gardner, who was an engineer specializing in software and programming. And he said, "Hey, since you're the first one here, and this just came in today, I'm going to give it to you, and you're going to learn this and teach everyone else how to use it." And it was the first desktop computer, as far as I know, in the department. And it was an Intel development system with 2 8-inch floppy disks on the top of it. It was a massive system, like a small console TV. And they gave me a cubicle, they put it on my desk, and they told me to learn this system. And that's what I did for the first few months there.
That's interesting. No pressure. So you were that young, and that you did that. So I'm curious too. I mean, you mentioned about your dad, but did you have did it mean much for you to work for Disney? I mean, it sounds like, given that you turned it down and everything, that maybe, it wasn't that big a deal, but did you realize what you were getting into at all when you started there?
No idea. I mean, our family went to Disneyland every year, usually just once a year. That was pretty common back then. It was kind of seen as something that you wouldn't go to more than once a year. It was kind of expensive and kind of a big deal to drive out to Anaheim from the valley every day, or for a day. And so we went once a year. Maybe in a special year we'd go twice. And I liked it. I loved Disneyland. I loved everything about it. But I was thinking more in terms of being in aerospace. I think I had started in college in engineering, and realized after a semester or two I really didn't like it. So I had switched to radio, television, film. This was 1980, and Disney at the time had Disneyland, which I'd been to, and they had Disney World, which I'd never been to. And so I really didn't appreciate what I was getting into at all until after I was there for a while.
So you mentioned that you worked on the desktop computer. So what did your role end up being? Like, I know it's an engineering aide, but kind of you could talk a little bit about kind of what you did there as you kind of went along at Disney.
Well, actually, my initial title when they hired me was a wirelister. And a wirelister is a person who takes engineering drawings. And if an engineering drawing shows, it's like a blueprint, but it shows a symbol of a cabinet on one side and a cabinet on the other side, and the cabinets have to be connected. And they show the connectors, and you have to make a list of all of the wires from connector A, pin 1, to connector B, pin 1 on the other cabinet. And the technicians in the field are going to wire these things up, but they need to know how they get wired up. And so my initial job was to create these schedules of wire lists from the engineering drawings. But they weren't quite ready for me to do that yet. So they threw me over to Mark Gardner and had me start working on learning the computer. And his project that he was working on currently was the Houston Wedway People Mover. So that was the first thing that I got assigned to. And I did the wire lists for the Houston Wedway People Mover. for probably 6 months or a year after I started. I don't really remember the timeline now. And that I was really excited about because it was transportation engineering. At the time, Disney thought, because of the monorail and the people mover, that one way for them to expand as a business was to create transportation systems for municipalities. They were really looking at it seriously, and they had a great engineer, a guy named David Turner, who I'm still friendly with to this day, and a guy named Bill Wolf, who was another great engineer. They were working on the design of the system with other companies that were outside of Disney and consulting firms, and they created this Houston Wedway people mover, and it was one of the few projects at the time that Disney did. It was finished on time and under budget, and it worked almost perfectly from day one. It had like 99.9% uptime, they called it, which is the time that it's operational and not having problems or shutting down systems or cars because there's issues. The thing was really well designed, and it ran really well, and Disney finished it and then said, no, we don't want to be in that business. And they never did another thing like it.
It's crazy. It's still bad because, I grew up I was a kid in the 80s and loved things like the people mover and the monorail and all that. And so now that I learn more as an adult about that, and, as a kid, I thought there's going to be people movers everywhere and it's going to be a thing. And it's still, I know a lot of it is Michael Eisner and what he wanted to do, but it's still it kind of bugs me because I think what could they have done or what could the technology have done? It's really cool you got to work on it because that Houston people mover is still kind of put out there as the one example. They never got further. So I think it's really cool you got to work on it. It's just too bad it didn't go further.
It was very frustrating because it was a success in every way. It did what they needed it to do. It did it well. It did it efficiently and had really good operational uptime. And they still said, nah, not right for us. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind because it foreshadows other things that happened to me later at Disney. It's kind of a recurring theme.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure, just with what I know about how things went, especially, we'll get to it, but after EPCOT and everything, it's a tumultuous time, I will say. But I'd love to hear about, I know you worked on the construction of EPCOT in some way. And I'd love to know just at first, when you got moved over to that and then what was the atmosphere like while EPCOT Center was kind of coming together?
Another case of my sort of ignorance as a young person, when they first asked me in 1981 or 82 if I wanted to go to EPCOT, because we were all working in Glendale and people were getting sent over there little by little. I think Linda Alcorn may have been the first one to go, and then other engineers followed quickly thereafter. And they said, David, do you want to go to Florida? And I said, no, thanks. I had no interest in going. I was actually still in college, of course. I was only at that point, 21 or something, and I didn't want to mess up my schooling. And they asked me to go, and I said no. And I was living with my girlfriend in Glendale, and I just didn't want to mess things up. And then after everybody started going and we started seeing pictures coming back and people started coming back with stories of what it was like to be in the field, I changed my mind and I was really regretting saying no. And things got so busy, they came back to me again in May of 1982. And they said, are you sure you don't want to go? And at that point I said, okay, I'll go. And I went for what was supposed to be a 3-month trip, and it ended up being, I think, 9 months. That took me all the way through opening day. And it was the most incredible experience of my life to that time. When we arrived, it was all mud. There was very little poured concrete. You were walking through the mud every day. The pavilions were up. Some still had open frames. They're installing stuff. There's cranes everywhere. There's earth movers everywhere. The first day I got on site, they said to me, go into the field, find the monitor cabinet, which was a cabinet of equipment that monitored the attraction and sent the data back to the Communicore. And they said, find the monitor cabinet for each attraction and make sure that the wire list and some other programming documentation is in the little pouch inside the door of the monitor cabinet. And in a way, it was kind of a hazing, but it was really actually a trial by fire because it was really a great way to get to know where every pavilion on the site was, where every monitor cabinet was, because I was going to be working on that for the next 9 months. So you kind of go through the site, and I thought, oh, this is quick. I'll go through each pavilion and find the monitor cabinet and, check the documentation and then, be back at the office in an hour or two. And I was probably out until late at night, just trying to find the monitor cabinets. The doors were locked. The buildings were closed. There was no way to get in. There were always issues. You get there and, you find the monitor cabinet. There'd be no documentation in it at all, or there'd be a wrong documentation. And so it was a really great introduction that first day just to go through the entire park.
That pretty much shows to me just how challenging it was, given that everything was still kind of, like you mentioned, in disarray with things being locked and open and everything. And also just how big Epcot is, because I know just walking around as a guest, it's a huge space. And I'm not even talking about back of house. I'm just talking about the park itself. So as it got closer to, during your time, it was very soon to when it opened. How chaotic was that? Like when things were still being put in and you were just kind of running all around. How crazy was that during that time?
I probably worked the least of anybody on my team, and I worked a minimum of 80 hours a week. Other people were working 100 hours. People who were working on American Adventure, there's 168 hours in the average work week, and they were working 140 hours.
Wow.
It was just people were getting 3 and 4 hours of sleep a night if they were lucky. I think we describe in the book where Glenn actually took a sleeping bag into American Adventure and was sleeping in the attraction. So he didn't have to waste time going home and showering and eating and those, pesky things. So it was very intense. And we all knew we were working hard. For the most part, we loved it. If you were there and you were single, you probably had no issues at all. It was really tough on the married people because it's just, even if you're working with your spouse at Epcot, it's just really hard either being apart that much or being on separate hours schedules because very few people are on the same schedule. So it was just really hard on the couples. There were a lot of divorces after Epcot, and a lot of people who went to Epcot single came back married. So it was, it was really a crucible for relationships and very tough on a lot of people.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. I mean, working that much and, especially the 140 hours, that doesn't sound very healthy either for anyone, but it's, I guess that's what it had to be done because at least, and I don't know how much, your work went with this, but there was so much new technology kind of being tried and being put into it. I mean, how much did you see of that? I mean, was it a challenge to kind of, for everyone to deal with all the technology that was kind of being put into that?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things like that were new to us and new to their uses. There were things that were, not that new technology, but they'd never been used in this way before. And so, the engineers there, though, because they were so young and so passionate, they didn't look at it as a problem. They looked at it as a challenge. They looked at it as something to overcome. And, that's why they worked 140 hours, because they would just hunker down with a piece of equipment until they mastered it. And, sort of on my personal side, one of the early on when I was there, when I transitioned from being a wirelesser to being an engineering aide, and they just had me basically just assisting the engineers in anything they needed. I kind of reported to all the engineers that were there. And I just kind of, when I was done with the task for one, I'd go to the next one and say, what do you need? And so early on, there was a trailer at the edge of the property called the Retreat. And it was just a horrible, like a double wide trailer with a dozen engineers crammed into it. And I went over there and said, what do you guys need help with? And again, it was Mark Gardner said to me, do you know assembly language? I said, no. And he goes, well, you got to learn it. And he gave me a stack of code, a printout about, an inch thick, and said, I wrote this program. There's a couple of bugs in it and I can't find them. So just go through this and learn the assembly language and figure out where the bugs are. And I spent like a week just going over the code and with a book on assembly language next to me so I could understand what he was doing. And at the end of the week, I found 3 bugs and I turned it back to him and he says, great, now here's another stack of code. So that's how I learned to code assembly language. It was just, everything was done sort of by Crucible and everything was, feet to the fire and everybody was in it together. And it was a really incredibly collaborative and intense environment.
Yeah, that sounds that way. And I know when you were on site, I believe you were living in trailers in Fort Wilderness. And what was that like?
It was great. For me, it was really my first extended time outside of California. And like I said, earlier, I didn't really want to go to Florida in the beginning. And after a few weeks in Fort Wilderness, I loved it. I loved Florida. I loved the humidity. I loved the afternoon rainstorms. I liked living in it was in the wilderness. There were bugs and critters everywhere, and you'd come home at night and there'd be palmetto bugs on the outside of your trailer that were 2 inches long, and it was just kind of an immersion. It was like camping out with kind of, I wouldn't say luxury, but with comfort at least. It was camping out with comfort in a really beautiful place. So you didn't mind working those hours because you went home and you were really kind of surrounded by beauty in a way that, Disney does so well.
I find it fascinating, just the whole thing, because now we look at it and everything's so put together, but it was just dirt everywhere and all that, like being on site. It was like, how close to the opening were things still kind of, in flux, or I guess still not ready?
Some pavilions were done, with time to spare, and others were still being tested on opening day. And, there were a few openings. There was an opening, I think, Labor Day. There was a soft opening. There was a soft opening, I think, September 23rd, which was for crew, which was, all the construction crew and employees were working there. There was the official grand opening on October 1st for the public. Even that was kind of a soft opening. There weren't massive crowds in the beginning, and things were still being ironed out. I think American Adventure, you're going to test my memory here, American Adventure, Spaceship Earth, and I think Imagination opened for previews for executives and then shut down immediately and didn't reopen again for a few months. I think everything else stayed open the way it was supposed to. And one thing that was really fortunate was that, the attractions like China, Canada, and France had movies. And once they got those running, they were really stable. So those were good ways to kind of, keep crowd capacity up, keep things going, get people in. And you didn't have to worry about, something breaking like you did in Spaceship Earth or an American Adventure, which were extremely technologically complex attractions. And, even probably for a few years after they opened, were still subject to glitches and, pauses in the show where they'd have to say, okay, everybody, we're going to reset, start it over, not let anybody in, send everybody out, and then, close it down for a few hours while they figured out what the problem was. There were still issues like that after opening.
Yeah, American Adventure, I'm still kind of boggles my mind, the amount of the technology for that show. Like, I've never gotten in there and seen behind the scenes, but it's one of the crazier things that I can still imagine. And the show is, almost 40 years old. It's crazy to me. And I know Spaceship Earth, same way at the time, just really high tech. So I'd love just to kind of sum it up, in terms of when you worked on Epcot. Like, you look back at it now, beyond kind of what we've discussed, like what stands out to you just about your work? Like, what are other maybe favorite memories or something that jumps out at you?
Really the camaraderie that we had, well, all the way through, really, it was really just a sense of, like, some people have compared it to sort of being in the military, but I think that's probably not quite an apt comparison, but it's similar in the way that you're undergoing a very intense experience and everybody's in it together. And the egos get shaken out pretty quickly. There were people who were sent back to California or people who were let go, and everybody else who's there is willing to work together, and you just work long, hard hours together, and you try to help each other out every way you can. And then when you're not working together, you're playing together, because basically whenever we weren't working together, we were out eating dinner together, we were out getting drinks together, we were going to the beach on weekends. You think, like, after spending all that much time with people, you'd be sick of them, but it was the opposite. We just really hung out together, and you have bonds with those people where the core team that I was working with then, I still see, personally now, and then they're still friends, and we're Facebook friends, and we get together when we can, and at least once or twice a year, and share memories. And it's just a really great, bond to have with working people that it's not that common. I didn't know at the time it wasn't that common. I thought everybody had jobs where you worked intensely like that and had these lifelong friends.
I think that part of it too might be that, correct me if I'm wrong, but everyone was really young too. Like, that's what amazes me when I look back at Epcot or even at some other parks that were built, is how many people were in there, like you mentioned your age, like we're in their 20s and we're doing just so many complicated things and working so hard. I guess maybe that's part of how you could do it, was being so young.
Yeah, because we did, like Steve likes to say, we didn't know it was impossible, so we did it. A lot of people were straight out of college. They just got their degree and started at Disney. They got their degree in May or June, and they started at Disney in July. I mean, that was really common. Management was more senior, definitely. Management was, and they were still young by today's standards. They were in their 30s, but they'd had a couple jobs. A few people came from aerospace, and they knew how to manage a big project. And they used to like to, talk about the fact that they left aerospace because they were tired of building bullets and bombs, they called it. And they wanted to build something that made people happy. So they came to Disney, and they managed projects, and they managed them really well. They were super organized, efficient. If you think of aerospace and you think of the good side of aerospace and the Apollo program and things like that, there were those sort of people making this happen. And they kind of figured out early on, get these young people in and unleash them and let them go at it. And, I can't imagine a 40-year-old being willing to go down there and work 140 hours the way a 24-year-old would.
Totally. And actually, the Apollo program is a really good comparison, because even I read up on that and the same sort of thing, where you look at a lot of the people that were working in mission control and everywhere, and you're like, they were so young. So many were under 30 and had so much responsibility. So that's a good connection. But I'd love to hear too, I know you worked on a few other projects when you were still at Disney, including the Fantasyland Rehab at Disneyland. I'm curious what you did for that one.
On that one, I was back to more just wirelessing. It was not as exciting for me personally. I was only on site. I wasn't on the site where the work was being done. I was at Disneyland for a couple of weeks, interestingly working in an office that was underneath Country Bear Jamboree. It was interesting because every afternoon, in the mornings it was quiet, and sometimes you could hear the music upstairs. And then in the afternoon, after lunch, the crowds came in and they were rowdier. And they were just more awake. And you'd be working, and suddenly the ceiling would be vibrating because people would be stomping their feet. And it was a really interesting environment. I loved the project when it was open. I was there for the opening day, and it was wonderful. But there was not much of excitement as far as my work on that. The one funny story I can tell you is there was an engineering office underneath Country Bear Jamboree I was lent to for that project. And my last day there, one of the guys who was there was actually leaving to go on elsewhere in the company or to another company. It was his last day, and he'd worked in that room for like 5 years with the music and the stomping. And so they gave him the soundtrack album of Country Bear Jamboree because they said he probably couldn't get any work done without it. So,
oh my gosh, 5 years. That sounds,
yeah.
I'm sure you have to blot it out at some point, but that's crazy.
Yeah, how many shows he must have listened to. And like I said, it was very faint. It was well-insulated floor, but you'd hear it in the morning. You'd hear the Bare Necessities being sung. And
oh yeah, especially the finale when they want everybody to clap and stomp, and it's like, oh boy, that would be a lot. So I know you also work some on Tokyo Disneyland, which opened just a bit after EPCOT. So I'm curious what you did there too.
Yeah, it's the same thing. But that was more back to the wireless thing and just preparing the wireless. I didn't get to go to Tokyo, but I prepared the wireless for the engineers who did. Guys like Ira Frank and John Noonan, who had really long careers with Imagineering, and I think probably 30 years plus. It was wonderful to see, and I have wanted to go there ever since, and I've actually never been to Tokyo Disneyland. It's on my bucket list for sure.
Same here. I haven't been there too. And someday I'll be able to make the trip, but from what I've heard, it's an amazing resort. So I want to talk to you. You mentioned the book, Building a Better Mouse, which you wrote with Steve about your experiences at EPCOT Center. And I really like the book, but I like the way it kind of what you described. It really brings us into what it was like day to day to be there. So I'm curious how you got into writing that book with Steve and how that came about.
At the time, I mentioned I had started off as an engineering major in college, and then I switched to radio, television, film. And then I switched again because what happened when I started working at Disney is I found out I could only take night courses, and I couldn't take radio, television, and film at night. So I switched to journalism and really discovered I loved writing. And so the last few months I was at Disney, everyone was being laid off. It was during the post-EPCOT and post-TDL layoffs. They told me I could keep my job if I would document all the systems for them. And so I got to work for like an extra 6 months, basically writing technical documentation for all of the systems I'd worked on, so they could keep them and maintain them after I left and after all the engineers were laid off. That's sort of got me more into writing, and I thought I should really write about my experience here because it was such a phenomenal experience. And I was really influenced by Hunter S. Thompson, whom I loved, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail and his books. And I loved Tom Wolfe, who wrote the Right Stuff. And I believe the movie of The Right Stuff had come out by that point. And I really wanted to sort of write the EPCOT experience with as much sort of gonzo feeling as I could because it was so intense. And I wanted to capture that. So I started writing this book. At the same time, I didn't know it, Steve Alcorn was starting to write a book, but from a different perspective. He wanted to sort of cover it from the perspective of the engineering achievement that EPCOT was. And we started working together again after we both left Disney. And we were talking one day at lunch, and we realized we were both writing a book. And he said, we should write it together. And so we started collaborating on it. And after sending a few drafts back and forth, our styles were just so different. And so we started kind of collaborating less and less and less. And then Lynn Electronics, the company we were working for, went out of business. And I went back to college to finish my degree finally. And Steve went on to work at another company called Cambrian Systems. And the book just, it just sat at that point and nothing happened with it. And then, 20 years later, I got a package in the mail, and it was the manuscript of the book that Steve had finished. He had taken everything I'd written and everything he had written, as well as all of Glenn Burkett's notes. That Glenn Burkett is sort of the uncredited third author of the book. He really deserves to be credited on the cover, because during the whole time of EPCOT, he knew what he was getting into. He knew how great it was. He kept almost a nonstop verbal record with a little mini pocket tape recorder of everything that was happening. Just to have something like that, a document in real time of, I just had a meeting with so-and-so, and here's what we discussed, or I just had, 3 hydraulics just blew up in the 4th carriage on American Adventure. I mean, for him to do all that in real time, it was great information and allowed Steve to kind of go back and mine his own memories for what had happened and talk to people and piece things together. And so Steve finished the book and sent it to me as sort of a galley proof. And I read it and I proofread it and I marked things up and I made changes and I added my own touch to a few things, and I sent it back to him and he published it. I was really lucky that he did that, because otherwise the book would not exist.
That always interested me about the book, because, it's written like came out, like you wrote it in 1983, and then it came out so much later. And I was always thinking, well, why did it take so long? So that makes a lot of sense. But, I always loved the idea too, the way the book was written, like it would kind of, it wasn't written like I did this. It was written like, your name's in there, David did this, or Linda Alcorn, or Glenn, or whatever. And so when you mentioned those other authors, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see it, because, and I know you didn't write all of it, but a lot of the part you wrote, it's very, like you said, it's kind of like you're there, but you don't always know, like, it's not straight narrative, like we arrived, we did this. It's very kind of all over the map. But I like that, because I feel like it gives us a better idea of what it was like. And you mentioned Glenn. There, I think, one chapter where it like has timestamps and it goes through like a day or a few days of what kind of he's doing. And so it's fun. I like the way that it kind of, there really isn't another book that gives you that experience, especially of that park. Most of the books are like the history. They talk about the attractions or they focus on that. They don't really focus on it from like your perspective. So I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I was really lucky. And that I give Steve all the credit for that, because when we were working early on, I was writing the book entirely from my perspective. And he was writing the book pretty much entirely from his perspective. And then we had the tape recordings from Glenn. And Steve said, we were talking like, how are we going to make this blend? And Steve said, kind of, let's composite it. It's either third person or it's I. And whenever it says I, it's really not any of us. It's all of us. It was a really good conceit, from a literary standpoint, to bring it together and give it that one voice, but multiple perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. It really, for someone like me that obviously only knows the park as a guest, to be able to kind of, for a few minutes, step into your shoes or step into Steve's shoes or everything, it's really fun. So I like that approach. And you mentioned too, your interest in journalism and English. And I know you have degrees in those subjects, like an MA in English. So what really got you excited about being a writer or about working in that field?
Well, it's kind of a bizarre path, because as I said, I started off as a radio, television, and film major, and then switched to journalism pretty much only because I couldn't get the classes that I wanted. And I knew I wanted to work in some sort of creative field. And so I wasn't a news journalist. I was more of an entertainment journalist. I was the entertainment editor on the university newspaper at Cal State Northridge, and I was the features editor one semester. I've always loved music. I've always loved the arts, and I wanted to report on it. I wanted to write about it, and I wanted to discover people, and that's kind of what got me into it. So it just, and then once I got my journalism degree, I finished that and realized that I really enjoyed the English classes I'd taken, and I wanted to be a better writer. And so I went back and got a degree in English after that.
Well, you can tell just with the book and how it's written that there's some writing style there for sure. Well, I don't want to go too far without, I should ask you then, you referenced it already, that you left WED and, were laid off and such. So, I mean, I don't know how much you want to talk about that, but I'd love to know at least a little bit about kind of that experience for you.
Yeah, there's a really interesting story that goes with that, because they were having layoffs, and they were laying off. It was not all at once. It was, many people a week for many weeks. And it had been dragging on, and it was almost always on a Friday, on a Thursday, and they'd call it Black Thursday. And it was, they'd start calling people into the management office up front, and then people would come back with their boxes and load up their boxes, and then they'd leave. And it was very stressful, and nobody knew when they were going to get the axe. I realized that it was getting to the point where our little team, the wirelessers and engineering aides, was about to get the axe. And it was like, none of us had been touched yet. We're finishing up our projects. One of us is going to go. And I had recruited two of my close friends to come and work with that group, who were both engineering majors and really wanted to stay with Imagineering. And on the other hand, at that point, I'd switched to journalism, so I knew I wasn't going to stay with engineering. And so on Wednesday, I walked into my boss's office and I said, look, I know we're probably going to have layoffs soon. And I want to let you know, if you're going to lay off any of the three of us on this team, that I volunteer to go. And he was really surprised. And he asked me why, and I explained it to him. And he goes, okay, that's a really fair reason, and it's a really nice thing for you to do. And I'll keep that in mind. And the next day on Thursday, they laid off a bunch of people, and they laid off nobody from my team. And I was really amazed. And I thought, well, I guess we dodged a bullet there. Maybe I was premature, and I'm not going to get laid off. And then the next day, they called me in, and I got laid off.
Oh, boy.
And so I think what happened is that they were probably planning to lay off one of the other guys. And my little notice was not early enough for them to fix it. So they had to delay it a day to get my paperwork together and laid me off the following day. And the layoff was so efficient and, kind in a way. They set you up with a counselor and somebody who helps you through the process. They had a company called Univance that were placement advisors, and they had like a big office fairly near to the campus, and you'd go in there and you could make calls and set up interviews, and they had multiple newspapers, so you could go through classified ads. There was no internet at that point to go through and find jobs. So it was a really nice program that kind of helped you launch into your next job.
Well, that's good at least to hear. Not the layoff part, but that's good to hear that they were doing that at least, because I've heard about it from others, and then also I know they talked about it on the Imagineering story series that came out recently, and it's sad that had to happen, because like you mentioned, there was this great environment and there was so much going on, but projects like EPCOT don't come around every few months or something. It's such a big project, but it's really too bad. But I do think, it's interesting that after a while, you ended up going back to Disney, not at WED, but in a variety of other roles during the 1990s. So I'm curious for you, what was that like to go back, and then maybe about some of the roles you did?
I had a friend who worked for, we worked at the same company, a company called CADM in Burbank. That was a division of Lockheed that created CAD/CAM software, similar to AutoCAD. And one of my friends left and went to Disney and got a job in IT. And IT was, sort of a growing field at the time. And he said, you've got to come over here. It's great. I've got a great boss. You'll really like it. And so I went and interviewed and got hired and worked in the studio IT department. And my boss was a guy named Art Holland, and I'm still friends with him today, a really good guy. And it was a sort of ragtag bunch of 8 guys who were all IT support people. And I was a Mac guy, and so I got assigned to feature animation because they were mostly Macs. The ratio of people you supported to technicians was kind of crazy. Like I had the fewest users. I had 150 users that I supported, and other guys had as many as 400. And we basically go out and help people use their computers at work. And things were new back then. Email was new. LaserJet printers were relatively new. This was 1986, I believe. No, sorry, 1990. This is 1990. So, yeah. So it was a very strange time and a great time to be working with computers back then. After I worked at Feature Animation for about a year and a half, there was a project that came up called FAME, which was the Feature Animation Management Enhancement Tool, which was something they used to do manually with old school hand-drawn animation. Is they would track where all the different cells were, where all the different scenes were, where all the different sequences of scenes were, and they tracked it on big spreadsheets basically, but they were all done by hand, and they wanted to do this with a computer. The group that was doing it was also run by Art Holland, my boss, and there was a guy on the team who wasn't performing well, and they fired him, and they asked me to come on, and I said, but I don't know the programming environment that you're working in. And he said, you can learn it. He said, you understand feature animation, and it's easier for somebody who understands feature animation to understand programming than to teach a programmer to understand feature animation. And so sort of like my first task at Disney is I was the one who came on and learned a programming language in order to help them put out this system. And I understand, I met with a friend who worked with feature animation, and this was in 1991, 92, and I heard that the system was still in use there.
Wow.
Which I can't believe. They must have updated it by now, but at least a system with the same name is in use there.
Wow. So yeah, I guess it's like a through line based on, like you said, you taught yourself the programming like with the book at Epcot, and now you have to do it again. I think somehow your bosses always can tell that you're going to figure it out or something.
Yeah, maybe. I'm actually still surprised when it happens. Maybe I'm not self-aware enough. I don't know. It's funny that that's happened a couple times.
So you worked at Disney generally through the 90s, right to early 2000s, I think, for about 11 years. So, I mean, just in general, kind of looking back at that, what was the environment like, or kind of, because the company was growing so much at that time in the 90s. I'm curious for you, just like with your roles, what was that experience like?
So much depended upon which department you were in. I mentioned when I started, I was at IT, and actually IT was hellish. It was actually really brutal. Not a really pleasant place to work. Basically, I was dealing with everybody from entry-level employees up to VPs at Disney. And you're kind of the IT guy, so you get mistreated a lot. You get yelled at a lot for things that aren't your fault. It was very stressful and long hours. I remember on my 30th birthday thinking I had made a horrible mistake because I was working and it was a long day, and I was having a really, really bad day. And then I got called into the VP of Finance's office because she was having problems printing a document. And because she was VP of Finance, she knew employee records. And somehow she knew it was my birthday. And she closed the door behind me. And she goes, I just want you to let you know, breathe, have a happy birthday. And it just made all the difference in the world. It's like, somebody knows it's my birthday. This is so nice. There's no cake or anything like that. But it was just like, okay. I felt really good. It helped me get through the day. The job I had after that was working with a group called Disney Televentures. And that was a project that was basically television over the internet before there was an internet. And it was a partnership with Disney and 5 telephone companies to create this service so that people could watch TV and do things like order pizza. If you see a Domino's ad come up, you'd press a button on the remote and you'd order a pizza. And order clothes. If you were watching a show and you love the clothes that the actor is wearing, maybe you do a search and you find out what they were wearing, you could buy those clothes. And it was a really ahead of its time concept. And we worked on it from 1995 to 2000. And then we rolled it out. It actually was tested in a few places through a company, GTE, which I don't even think they're around anymore, a telephone company. And it was very successful and people loved it. And just like the Houston Wedway People Mover, just before it was about to roll out, Disney said, yeah, we don't really want to be in that business anymore. And they shut that project down. And then literally the week I was about to be laid off, my boss called me into his office and he said, hey, we're going to start a new division at the company. And we're going to create basically a lift of what we've been working on for the last 5 years. And it's going to be part of movies.com. And it was basically, Netflix in 2001. And we worked on that for a year, and it was coming along really well. And at the end of the year, the analysts at the company looked at it and said, yeah, there's not enough broadband penetration for this to be profitable. And they killed the project.
Oh, boy.
And, here we are now, almost 20 years later, Disney Plus just coming out now, which is basically the same concept, at least, of what we had worked on back then.
Knowing how internet was at that time, I can understand it, but it's still too bad because, yeah, they kind of were a bit behind the curve. Now Disney Plus is great, but that it took that long, it's interesting that you had that experience. Yeah.
I mean, I think if they had just rolled it out slowly and within 3 years, there were other companies doing similar things. And I think Disney would have owned that space if they had stuck with that project. They really would have been so far ahead of the game. With both of the projects, with both of the Disney Televentures and the movies.com. It breaks my heart still to this day. So it's been, basically 6 years of my life working on projects that never got realized.
Oh, I can imagine. I mean, because it's one of those things where you're kind of doing this new technology and it has so much promise and it's exciting. And then just bam, done. And it seems a little more foresight might have led to something different on the company's part, for sure.
Yeah, I think so. And, no, to be honest, nobody knew back then how big the internet was going to be. They knew it was going to be big, but just not how big.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I don't mean to be too critical. I think that so many companies now look back and just go, what were we doing? So it's not a rare story, I'm sure. But I'd love to ask you too. I know you have some other interests that I find interesting. One of them is you're a photographer and you've done a lot of, in fashion and architecture and music. So I'd love to know a little bit about that. What do you do there?
Yeah, photography is something I've done since I was a little kid. My dad gave me a camera when I was 9, and I was immediately hooked. And I had a film darkroom in my bedroom closet when I was in my teens. So I've always done photography. And about 2005, when digital photography started getting real, I bought a Canon digital camera, and really have just gotten totally sucked into that. I did it professionally for a few years as sort of a side business to my main business of doing user interface design. But now I just do it as a hobby and as an art form. It's sort of passion and release. I love photography. I love doing it. I was president of the Santa Clarita Valley Photographers Association for a couple of years and met a lot of great photographers. And it's just a great creative release for me.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. And it fits with everything else, I think, that you've done with writing and so much more. And also, I'm a big fan of just the history of, I mentioned Apollo earlier, very interested in all that. And I believe you wrote some software about the history of manned spaceflight and then some astronomy logs. So what excites you just to do that?
Being in Florida, when I was working at EPCOT in 1983, we went and saw one of the early shuttle launches. It was just the most spectacular event that you can imagine. We were 5 miles away in a sort of a VIP viewing area. One of the guy's fathers worked at Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy and got drive-on passes for us. And so we were one of the closest places you can be, and it's 5 miles away. And when that thing takes off, you feel it. You feel the vibration all the way through your body. And it's just such a visceral thing. Everybody there is staring at the sky in sheer awe and wonder and amazement. And before that, even I was into the space program through Apollo and the moon landing. I was 9 years old when we landed on the moon. So I've always had a love for the space program. And one of the guys I worked with at EPCOT, a guy named Andrew Dombeck, we got to be really close friends. And I decided at the time to create a HyperCard stack. HyperCard was a software development environment on the Mac. And I created a HyperCard stack for him for his birthday one year. And it was all in manned space flight. And I went into the warehouse where I was working. They had a shrink wrap machine. And I shrink wrapped the disk for him, and I made it look like it was professional. And I gave it to him. And he thought it was a piece of professional software. And when he found out that I had created it for him, he said, "You have to sell this." And so I found a company called Heiser Software that picked it up and distributed it for me for many years until Apple deprecated HyperCard and stopped distributing it.
Wow, that's interesting. That that you were able to present it in such a good way, and also too, it was really exciting for me just to see there was the recent space flight that finally there was manned spaceflight from Cape Canaveral again, and how cool that was, especially given what's going on in the world. It was kind of a nice thing to see.
Yeah, I loved watching that. It felt wonderful. A nice little bright spot in a very horrible year.
Oh, for sure. So I want to finish by asking about what you currently do. I know you're currently the president and COO of Visual Terrain. So I'd love to know what Visual Terrain does and kind of what your role is.
Yeah, Visual Terrain is a lighting design company that was founded by my wife, Lisa Passamani Green, in 1995, just celebrating 25 years now. And she's a lighting designer who came up through theater at San Diego and worked at Imagineering. And strangely enough, we didn't meet through Disney at all. We met through outside friends. Her college dorm roommate was friends with a guy I worked with. And that's how we met. And she had the company called Passamani Lighting Design. And she started that. And in 2001, Passamani Lighting Design became Visual Terrain. And then in 2010, her other two partners at Visual Terrain left to pursue other things. And she said to me, "I need help running the company. You know how to run a company, so you're coming on board." So I didn't have a lot of choice in the matter, but I was really happy to do it. So since then, I've been involved in the world of lighting design and perversely coming back into themed entertainment through sort of the side door, because that we do a lot of work for themed entertainment. We do a lot of work for Disney and Universal and Chimalong and other clients that are in the industry. And so even though I'm more day-to-day operations, I don't do any of the lighting design, and something I'm probably not going to learn at this stage of my life. But we have a team of 13 people, and it's something I didn't even know existed really before I met Lisa. And now here I am running this company and really enjoying it.
So yeah, I'm curious too. Just you mentioned getting back into theme entertainment. For you personally, are you interested in that? I mean, how interested are you, and what kind of excites you about it?
Yeah, well, it's funny with the history I have. One of the things about working at Disney that I'm sure you know about is they have for employees something called a Silver Pass. And the Silver Pass is basically a card you carry in your wallet that lets you into the park at no charge. You and 3 guests can enter the park anytime you want. Over the years, it's gotten more and more restricted. When I was younger, it was literally anytime you wanted, you could get in. And now there's blackout days and things like that. But I got really spoiled having a Silver Pass. And I would go to the park as often as, in the summer, maybe every week. I'd go during the holidays just to see the lights. And I wouldn't even go on any rides. I would just get into the park and go into Main Street and grab a bite to eat and look at, people watch and enjoy the light shows. And so I got really spoiled. And when I got laid off from Disney in 2001, and the first time I had to go back to the park and pay for it, it was really difficult to do. And it was really difficult to be there with crowds, and it was really difficult to pay that much money. And so I still love the parks, and we of course go there as often as we can because we need to keep up on what's new in the parks for the sake of our business. But I don't have the same joy that I had when it was just, I could go every week and just sit back and enjoy it and people watch. And maybe after I'm retired, that'll come back, because then I will be able to go anytime I want.
Totally, yeah. Because in a sense, when you're going and it's like your money and it's like maybe more, it's like a vacation. Whereas before, I almost feel like it's the same, like if, I was going to a park in my city, or if going to a local attraction where, yeah, you're just like, there's no pressure because you'll be back next week. It's just, it's almost like, it's not your home, but it's like a secondary place that you just go to chill for a while.
Yeah. And when you have that relationship with it, it's really magical. And for all the employees that are still able to do that, I'm sure they'll say how wonderful it is just to be able to go to the park on a Tuesday afternoon when there's nobody there, in the middle of October or something, and just chill and just enjoy the park for what it is. And, you start noticing details. You start noticing how well everything is done and how clean everything is. And you really get tuned to sort of the essential nature of the theme park. And it's kind of special. You build up a special relationship. It's sort of like when I was working at EPCOT and we were working in the mud hole and everything was crazy and it was insane. And then things got cleaner and they poured the concrete and the buildings went dust free and everything was really nice. And we were working under Communicore at the park, and we'd walk through the park every day. We'd go and check out as the shows were being brought up, and we'd do the testing, and we'd run through the tests till 3 a.m. And it was really this great thing. And then on opening day, you look out the gate and there's 30,000 people waiting to get in, and you realize it's not my park anymore. And it's sort of the same thing with the Silver Pass. When you don't have that, it's not your park anymore, and you're sharing it with everybody else, and it's still great, but your relationship has changed.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I've never had that experience, but I can definitely understand just being, especially being involved at EPCOT, but even just in general. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about is, of course, you're also the president of Monteverde Creative, which is the design consulting company that you started in 2001. So I'm curious about that and how much you're doing on that these days.
I'll be honest, I'm not doing much on that. That company was started when I left Disney the second time. I was looking for a job, and my wife said to me, "Why are you looking for a job? You can never work for anybody again. Why don't you just start your own company?" And I said, "Yeah, I don't know if I want to do that." She said, "You've been watching me do it for several years. You can do it." And so I was kind of thinking, yeah, maybe I will. And literally the next day, a friend of mine called and offered me a consulting gig. And I thought, okay, I guess the universe just sent me a big, clear message on what I'm doing next. So I started the company. And for basically from 2001 until 2011, when I officially joined Visual Terrain, I did UI consulting primarily for large entertainment companies like Disney and DirecTV. And it was really, it was a great run. Once I started Visual Terrain, I still did it for a while, but for the last few years, I really haven't done any of that. I keep it open in case something happens.
Right. Just in case. You never know.
Like my whole life has been a series of strange coincidences and odd phone calls when I least expected it. So it's like, yeah, I'll just keep this here. It's you just never know when something's going to happen.
Oh, for sure. And I think that's a through line throughout your career. Well, David, this has been amazing. I've really enjoyed learning more about your story and so many different things that you've done. It's been really cool. So if somebody's listening and they want to learn more about maybe visual terrain or connect it all online, is there somewhere they should go?
www.visualterrain.net.
Excellent. Well, David, thanks so much. It was a blast. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. It was even more enjoyable than I expected. I really just enjoyed reminiscing and chatting with you. Thanks so much.
If you like this show, you should check out my interview with David's co-author, Steve Alcorn, from episode 43. You can find that and a lot more at tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end. If you'd like to help out this listener-supported show, you should go to tomorrowsociety.com/member. You can become an official member of the Tomorrow Society and help to support the show. I want to give a shout out to my latest member, Christian Rochelle. Thanks so much, Christian. It really helps out a lot. You can also leave a one-time contribution at tomorrowsociety.com/tipjar. If you'd like to get a hold of me, send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. And you can find me on YouTube at tomorrowsociety.com/YouTube. Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time is my big show all about improving Epcot. I'm going to give my ideas for what I think should happen to make Epcot even better. And I'm going to include a bunch of your ideas that you've submitted during the past month. It's going to be super fun, and I suspect this will not be a short show. Take care of yourself out there. Please wear a mask. Help everyone out. We can do this. You can do this. I'll talk to you again very soon.